Now the floor is open for questions that you can pose in any language you know. Except for Chinese.
Well, I first of all would like to ask a question to my colleagues, so kind of, liven up the audience as well. I wanted to ask Ilya, this weak point that I saw in my report, thanks to your report, that has to do with the understanding of war and understanding of war as a non-violent meaning of it, if I understood one of your thesis correctly. Benjamin himself looks at the rightful war and the revolutionary terror through this Kantian idea of the possibility of the critique of this whole point. We critique violence, but we critique violence in a sense, we're not saying, we've overcome it as pacifists through non-violence. Because then behind these terms, we're going to have some violent moral themes behind it. But the weak point in my report, which I can acknowledge, I don't know if it's been pointed out by Magun, my internal opponent, but the weakness is that the old definitions that we use, behind them, there is a layer of some subconscious, sacralized, and further secularization in history. Violence, in this sense, has something that we do not understand. We say violence, we know what it is, or we think we know what it is, but we know we've been beaten before, but that's all we know. We've been shut up. We know that we don't get some chances, that there are some limitations to our freedom. But what is violence? We don't really know. Because when we are being violated, we cannot think. So when Zizek says that there is a language violence which is possible, and he critiques Benjamin and Krichny for sort of, lack of empathy, that there is so much violence in the language, this hidden subconscious themes, like, what's being in Heidegger's discourse, and however Derrida tries to, wash it off. But my question is, can you count a war as a result of long-going sacralization, as an attempt of people to hide and mask the violent acts towards each other and the processes of exchange, revenge that produces a result, and that we call, according to Bataille, this holy war, that allows us to call the war, the mutual murder of people, to justify it, to call it holy, to say we are fighting in a holy fashion. But what's the question? The question is, do I understand Ilya correctly? That the war reaches out from this doomed historical subconsciousness that can be interpreted positively, consciously, or it can be justified even. No? Yes, no? Well, I never said that. Well, actually, I said the opposite. Well, no. I actually haven't tried to justify the war. I actually was anti-war speaker. The pathos that I had was anti-militaristic. I'm very grateful for this question, but I'd like to start with actually a very important topic, a topic of a linkage between war and revolution. Because Hannah Arendt, in her book on the revolution, she begins with the sort of analysis. She says that no revolution was separated from a war. In history of all revolutions, either a war provoked a revolution or a revolution caused a war, where it's civil war or some external conflict. And the connection between the war and the revolution, according to Hannah Arendt, is a connection which is similar to the connection between revolution and counter-revolution, and she lists this famous statement of de Maistre from his Thoughts on France, when he says counter-revolution is never a return to the pre-revolutionary state. Counter-revolution is never a restart, is always an overcoming of the revolution through the denial, through counteraction. And for de Maistre, who was, a religious person, all of this was sort of a realization of a divine concept. So the revolution is a part on the way of the carrying out this concept, which found it limit expression, and counter-revolution having opened the true meaning, the true idea of what this order of things set aside by the revolution hides. And the relationship between the war and the revolution, it would always hide in the fact that the war constantly changed and deformed the meaning of the revolution. It turned into something else. From what French Revolution went into this militaristic state, the reaction of Bonapartism and the French Revolution was suffocated by the hands of those who protected it in the militaristic conflict. The civil war in Russia, which ended with a victory, but the roots of the rebirth, the roots of Stalinism, the cause of Stalinism, was laid in the violent consequences that the civil war brought. So there's constantly a contradiction. There cannot be the revolutionary war idea that every revolution has is a deep illusion that contains this grave mistake, grave error that every time led to some horrific consequences. And all of that Arendt writes when she analyzes the French Revolution in her book. The next point is how the war can hide the violence, can conceal the violence. Let me quote Junger. He has a very touching part in his book where he explains that in the war he never felt any hatred towards the people he fought against. He believes that lack of hatred is a quality of a good soldier. As Englishmen or French, they're wonderful people that I really liked, actually. I had to kill them because that's the war. That's the laws of the war. And I believe this lack of hatred, or this friendliness expressed in the war, because when you read the texts, it feels like, he was learning how to love people, how to note cute and positive details as he was killing people. He killed a person, then he came up and said, oh, he had this wonderful, sincere face. I read his letters, and that's the letters that he wrote to different women in London. They were quite witty, and in general, I felt, very sort of niceness towards the people. But if he hadn't killed him, he would not have found out how truly wonderful this person was. And this opening of friendliness and lack of hatred, the underlying lack of hatred, is directly opposite towards the idea of divine violence as a manifestation of what Benjamin calls a manifestation of rage. No. Divine violence is a completely different thing. Oh, I understand that. Okay, well, here we go, arguing, but not a divine violence, but what he calls a manifestation, what has to do with the expression of rage, the expression of violence that stays over the border of the relationship between goal and means. Whereas the war disciplines the violence, turning a soldier into a polite person. A soldier turns into a polite person. Well, when we talk as if everyone has read this book. This is a very important book. Benjamin's book is very basic. And I'm, very grateful to Gerald that he was able to read the main extracts out of it. But the clashes for 100 years that are happening around this text, from Schmidt, who started the discussions of it, to today, this constant shitstorm between Critchley and Zizek that we can see, or the argument with Butler. You can say this is not an accidental text. It's very mysterious. I want to say that this point that Ilya just talked about, this is one of those mysteries, very different in their political views to the philosophers that address this topic of wrath. They get lost in this problematics because Benjamin himself, it does not make it evident. It's sort of a parable when he writes, I believe, about wrath that justifies the expressions of pure violence. It has to do with this mythical violence, I believe, because he talks about that he is a manifestation of gods, some mythical gods, not this Judaistic God. When we talk about not about a Messiah, but about a divine violence, but this mythical gods, they cite their wrath. Oh goddess, hail your wrath, as if this wrath justifies everything. But a lot of this antique books start with this wrathfulness of gods, as if there is a manifestation behind them of their being, but not of their will. There is a very astute differences that the first time reader can't even notice. I read them 100 times and then I translated and then I start getting it. I'm not giving an answer to my own question, but I'm just giving a further discussion point. How can we consider the wrathfulness, if we leave aside Benjamin's God, how wrathfulness is justifying for anything in our legislative society? This person was in a state of effect. He killed 10 people, but okay, well, he was in effect state. Go home. And the other one would say, I killed every sucker on my way, and then I'm gonna sit in jail. And then, well, what? It's absurd. It's delirious, what we're hiding behind this violence term. The violence as a state of being. We say being, and we think we're thinking something, but the thinking's over. Oh, then why did you all talk about violence so much? Well, look, I found a quote in your translation. I want to read it. Thank you so much. Here we deal with the unmediated function of violence that it's found in everyday life experience. That when it comes to a human is evoked to evident explosions of violence that is going towards the goal, which is not a mean but a manifestation. And I just wanted to remember another important thing to this topic, which Hannah Arendt addresses in her text on violence. She talks about how violence can be discarded as a state of effect, or the violence is rational. And her point of view is no, that violence is never rational. And she says that even this wrathful act of violence when a decision on applying violence is taken in a matter of split second. Even in that case, it's rational, because the point of this violence is what is called the immediate restoration of justice. So through this act, a person wants to immediately punish whoever acted unjustly. So in the state, this rational explanation of wrath, of rage, is, it sort of rhymes, but no. Well, I wanted, that's what I said in my speech, the added value of violence, this added moment of pleasure, which sort of slipped away from you. The person who says that they apply Junger, he says, when they apply violence, they don't talk about friendliness. He doesn't speak about the pleasure that cutting a throat brings to you. It's out of the question, because it's a very important moment that has to do with divine manifestation. There is no gods. There are people that try to sacrilege, to make sacred the murder of somebody else, because it's a great fucking pleasure. But with this pleasure, we can tame it, right? We don't have to turn into Prahanov, and with Schmidt and Junger and Dugin and others, glorify how we love killing our compatriots. Well, I want to add, see, I didn't quite get what Igor was just saying, but this line, I agree that indeed it's not just a matter of violence as a fact, but it's a matter of violence that comes with an interpretation. Violence is not an object, it's a theory. And theory always has this mystical character to it. There is power, that's fine. But then there's violence, and it's the same power, only we don't understand why is it that there's some resistance, or this power is actually good power, kind power, but it has to use mean means, and that's means to an end, and then violence is necessary because it's a mean. And the potential way out here is just to ignore violence as a bad, non-philosophical term. And Gerald said for a reason that in German language there is no such thing, because Gewalt is initially a legitimate power as well, but legitimate power that sometimes has to be firm. Gewaltende. But it doesn't mean that it's violence. Gewalt is not violence, as I sense it. But then there's a liberal interpretation of this term when translated into English, and it brings forth this idea not mysticism, but of irrational, that there is rational is government, but irrational is violence. No, hang on. I cannot agree with you. You're gravitating towards Schmidt again, because an English translation of which I'm particularly proud of, I corrected this mistake. Because in terms of Waltende, there is a sovereign translation, and Žižek bases his interpretation of the last fragment of because. Oh, I wish he didn't speak English really, but he bases his interpretation on the translation. There is plenty of links. There's translated by Edmund Givcott, but Waltende. And I'm very, very grateful to Gerald for his explanation of this mystical word. There is some creativity to it, right? But you don't have to be too excited about it, because if we translate Waltende as a creating, we're losing the connotations, the element of domination. And of Derrida, in his interpretation, his famous interpretation of this text, he says, as he likes to say, that Waltende actually is Walter, like a Walter gun, and then Walter the name. It's a signature. Signature is a signature. So this is a very important notation that cannot be omitted as a subconsciousness of this text, that we, as the polite people, trying to not to discuss, whereas every person wants the death of the other, which is also very important.
Just wanted to say something about this Derrida interpretation, which is a nice joke for me, but an over-interpretation. From some, I mean, it's plausible, but for me it's an over-interpretation to stress this aspect of the signature writing. But it's a good joke. My main thing that I wanted to say is repeating what I said before. I think there is a strong line between Walter Benjamin on the one side and the whole conservative revolutionary tradition with Sorel, with Jünger in very different ways. Sorel, Jünger,
It's not conservative revolutionary.
yeah, sorry. This is, as I said, very different. There are different modes, but there are problematic aspects, different problematic aspects in Sorel, in Jünger, especially in Jünger, in Schmidt, and also in Heidegger. I would say Benjamin plays on a different level. And if you can contaminate the Benjaminian legacy with, I would call it conservative revolution, there's a real problem of disambiguation. Yeah.
But who got by?
I think even both of my fellow, but especially Ilya, I would say.
Ilya. Well, see, I'm very much concerned with this conservative position because I wanted to say that I'm not ready to count Sorel to the conservative revolutionists. Jünger was a bad guy.
Sorel, you know, was part of a radical right French action.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. Sorel was a very ambivalent figure that, apart from the participation in Action Française, but not participation, but closeness to it, which Joe just mentioned, he went along evolution, but he started his way from reformism, because initially Sorel was a Marxist of Brazilian kind, and in the end of the 19th century, but through some long bypasses, he turned into this pathway of anarchic and syndicalian stage of his intellectual activity, during which he created the Thoughts on Violence. And I believe each of these stages was a denial of the previous one, and each of these stages gave a possibility to a very firm, very radical, very extreme critique of the preceding stage that Sorel, confessed before. So Sorel, in general, cannot be linked to any camp because he had a problem with everyone, with fascists, with Marxists, with anarchists, because he was simultaneously all three of those. And at the same time, he was a critique of all three of those. But there are figures like that. But there are figures like that in the political history like that. But I think we should look at him through the prism of this ambivalence. And I believe the key, which I could have developed this thought, I thought about it a lot, but I don't want to take up too much time. The key, what brings together Sorel and Benjamin, is not the idea of the unified universal strike, or not the parallels in their understanding of a problem of violence that Benjamin talks about in this text. The key, I think, what brings them together, what Benjamin took from Sorel, is the idea of a catastrophe. Sorel is an author who, through denial of Bergstenian positive, progressive Marxism, comes to the idea that capitalism should be stopped. Capitalism doesn't create the contradictions that can bury it under its own ruins and give a chance to build a new society. That's the basis of what Sorel calls a revolutionary pessimism, that we constantly have to decline some utopian image of the future, because we have a catastrophe if we don't make the stop, which is the overall giving up work in the form of universal strike. And this is it's a dialogue between him and Benjamin, that you should pull the stop lever. I think this line, this inheritance is very important.
I wanted to ask another question. Maybe we have like 5 minutes left, and
a question from the audience. We've had a great discussion here today. A great time at least.
could you tell me, this problem of violence as a problem, is it linked to Marxism? Was Marxism the first to set it as a problem, or was it viewed as a problem before Marxism? Maybe, it's a question to Ilya mainly, but well, naturally, this problem of violence, Marxism was not the first, but the problem of violence, this kind of a problem, the way it is asked, the way we talk about it, it's not maybe Marxism, but the leftist tradition views it in this sense. But the way we view it, it's a question of how violence is linked to the relation to power, oppression, and overcoming this. Lukács, who is also famous for being a Marxist saint or neo-Marxist saint, he wrote an article trying to discuss this moral problem of Bolshevism, and it. The violence we use before we overthrow the preceding regime, the capitalist regime, not only brings a new hegemon, but brings a new circle of violence. How do we break the circle? Lukács viewed it as a moral, a Marxist problem. He couldn't solve it theoretically. Practically, he solved it by, becoming a party member in a week. But everything in his text said you shouldn't do that. Benjamin, on the contrary, said, well, you should become, part of the revolutionary crowd, start the strike. But he never joined the party. It's a paradox in a way.
Question? Last question, maybe.
I think you should give the female colleague also the chance to ask a question out to me after all the voice club. Anyways, so I was just thinking, I'm sorry that I had to miss the first part of the panel, this is actually something that I've been thinking about when we were talking, and I didn't hear what Peter was saying. But one thing that struck me as being missed in the discussion is the Sorelian notion of social myth, which has always been hijacked and kidnapped by many afterwards. But going back to what Gerald was saying, I think that what we also have to maybe invoke is the fact that what Benjamin obviously takes from Sorel is this idea of social myth, but also he acts in a moment of complete dissolution, where the mass proletarian strike, he can still invoke it, but it's already not. So it's already the moment of failure, right? So I think that if you think about the nature of law that is ingrained in how Benjamin perceives violence, because violence is the constituent part of law itself. Therefore, he talks about the lawmaking and law preserver, because none nothing that's there to keep the law that's going to come there and break that law to create a new law is just going to be the continuation of the violence, right? So in order to break that spell of teleology that makes us go to certain ends, I guess then what Gary you were trying to say, as far as I understand, that we need to break with politics and law as such, and basically figure out a way to come to a completely different understanding of both the nature of law and politics. That would, on one hand, mean a complete disentanglement of subjectivity and law, and voluntary subjugation and voluntary servitude, and I'm not just using an anarchist terminology on purpose here, but that also means the implication of certain anti-politics. Would you then connect that in a sense of this molecular or individual disidentification, disentanglements to a certain militant exodus, a way to break the spell of this myth of law?
Question for Gero.
Yes and no. Yes, I completely agree on the level of that there needs to be maybe a set of ruptures, not one big event, but a set of ruptures with state and law. But nevertheless, I insist on the aspect of constituent power, and there is a reason why the term constituent power is near to constitution, which is mainly a legal term. Of course, in the wording that Negri put up in Potere Costituente, insurgencies is the English term, combines exploding the law and inventing it anew. And of course, it combines also sociality and new legal systems. And my example for that in the last decade is the very interesting and extraordinary developments in Latin America concerning new constitutions, but not only new constitutions as fundamental law, but especially the process, how they became invented. I'm talking about the Chavesian constituent process in Venezuela. I'm talking about Ecuador and Bolivia. And I think, of course, this is always a bit near of the danger of reformism, but I think that, for instance, the wonderful indigenous term of Sumak Kafsai, which was inserted into the Eurocentric post-colonial law of Ecuador, is one possibility to bring a monster in this case into law. So that's the no part in a way. I think there are also possibilities of radically transforming the law into something which is not a state apparatus.
Well, maybe this last question there. Do you still want to ask a question?
Yes, for sure. Because we were talking a lot about war and about
Speak up a little bit.
And I was just thinking about what is today war. That these terms changed a lot, and we saw a lot of different war, political war. I don't know, so if someone can say just before about war is today.
What is war?
Today. War.
Today.
Well, it's a big question. Do you want to come?
I think we could refer back to yesterday. You saw some images of what work looks like in the film of Sorel. Otherwise, it's a too big question.
To my mind, it's a well, I have a funny example of a non-declared war that our state is leading in Ukraine. It's provocative and demonstrative. We're not going to go too deep into the matter, but it's obvious that when you don't declare war, it somehow doesn't exist. But de facto, there's violence. It is there, and it begets new violence. And we'll probably have to reap the results in the process of our, in our life, during our lifespan. So this war, it's going on all the time. Agamben has told us already about it. We didn't believe him. It's a symptom of what you've been talking about. In a situation when violence is not legitimate, it grows. We have more violence in non-legitimate form. It was, in a cynical way, it would have been better if the war had been declared. But in today's situation, it's an absent. It's an infinite thing. And Ilya was very right in saying this. We're in a very dangerous moment when our government they made revolution a part of war. It has been done before by the Americans, but our government are doing it in a more brilliant way maybe. Once you have revolution, you have a military operation parallel to it. And it changes. It changes the situation radically of the past. The situation of the past 200 years. We have to rethink the notion of political struggle itself. I think we have to rethink the issue of the world character of revolution. We need a global revolution. Otherwise, if it's not universal, if it's not a global revolution, it can be transferred into a war. And all the war conflicts that we are witnessing today, they are linked to revolution, and they're consequences of revolutions, direct consequences. And these wars are linked to revolution not as counter-revolution, but they distort the idea of revolution from within. And this interrelation, this interaction and transformation of revolution into a war, it's very dangerous, and it's a major problem that liberation movement faces. On the other hand, it opens up another perspective, a perspective of revolution, and revolutionary upheavals are no longer something oppressed by the state. They are part of strategy of interstate game the states are playing. And this Islamic State, its example is astonishing. It's a state which doesn't want to be acknowledged. It has declared war to everyone. In the course of a week, they declared war on Syria, on America, on Russia, on Iran, on Ramzan Kadyrov personally, on Al-Qaeda. They have declared war on every subject. It's an absolute enemy. And this enemy is a result of all those parties creating an enemy. So we have an enemy nobody wants to deal with. Whose partner can it be in this situation? And there are discussions going on how this international coalition opposing this Islamic State, how this coalition would look like. what would be the basis value for this coalition? This enemy is so ultimate, and it's so convenient for everyone, and it's an absolute enemy, constituting something which is beyond the existing order of things. I'm not going to say it's not reactional, but I'm afraid. Well, thank you, Vilja. We have to keep in mind that we have
stop
to.
now. We'll be completely lost with our schedule. We're already 40 minutes over, but I think we'll start the next panel right at 2:30. So please don't linger at lunch. Let's thank everyone.